Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive with us. We are going beyond the numbers today. We're diving into the fascinating world of personal finance, but with a bit of a twist. We're exploring the human side of money, all those emotions and biases, and even the stories that we tell ourselves about wealth.
Yeah.
And to guide us, we'll be using Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money.
Such a good pick. It really is.
Have you ever wondered why people make those financial decisions that seem kind of crazy from the outside?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Or how can you build wealth without, needing to be a Wall Street whiz?
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Well, this deep dive is going to help us understand those things and maybe even ourselves.
A little bit better. Exactly.
I think what's really interesting about this book is that it shifts the focus away from pure economics and more to the psychology, like you were saying, the often irrational human behaviors that shape our relationship with money.
Yeah, it's not just about the numbers.
It's about our emotions, our biases, and like you said, even the stories we tell ourselves about wealth. And once you see those hidden forces, it really reveals a lot about why we make the financial choices that we do.
Definitely.
So one of the first principles that Housel introduces is this idea, the no one's crazy principle.
I love that one.
It sounds super simple, but it's actually incredibly powerful. It boils down to this. Everyone makes financial decisions that make sense to them at the time, based on their own experiences and their worldview.
It's so true. We have to remember that even decisions that seem bonkers from the outside looking in totally have their own logic when you consider that individual's background and their motivations.
For sure. And Housel, he actually dives into a really specific example of this, the world of low-income lottery ticket buyers.
Oh, yeah.
On the surface, spending your safety net on a tiny chance of winning big might seem completely irrational.
Right.
But the book really helps us understand the reasoning behind it.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way.
So imagine for a second. You're constantly struggling to make ends meet. You're feeling trapped by your circumstances.
Yeah, I can see that.
And then there's the lottery. Even with its astronomical odds, it represents this glimmer of hope, a chance to escape a life of financial hardship so suddenly. That potential reward, however improbable, it starts to feel worth the risk.
Yeah, it kind of reframes the whole thing when you put it like that.
Totally. And that's what the no one's crazy principle is all about.
Yeah.
It reminds us not to judge other people's financial decisions without really understanding the full context.
Yeah, we all have our own unique stories and beliefs that shape how we think about and interact with money.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of stories, Housel uses a really captivating analogy to explain the power of compounding.
Oh, yeah. What's that one?
He compares it to a thin layer of snow. Imagine a thin layer of snow in a cool summer.
Okay.
At first. You might not think much of it.
No, not at all.
But over time, that tiny bit of snow can snowball into this massive glacier.
Whoa.
And ends up transforming the entire landscape.
Right. I like that.
Compounding is like that. It's one of the most fundamental concepts in finance. And it works the exact same way. Small, consistent savings and investments that you make over time can grow into astonishing wealth.
It really is amazing.
But the thing is, most people underestimate its power. Because it's not linear. It's like that snowball effect. It starts slowly.
Right.
But the growth accelerates exponentially as time goes on.
It just keeps building and building.
Exactly. And I think the most striking example of this is Warren Buffett. Can you believe that 99.9% of his wealth was actually accumulated after his 50th birthday?
Seriously?
Yeah. And after he qualified for Social Security.
That's wild.
So think about that. If he had only invested from his 30s to his 60s, his net worth would be 99.9% lower.
So basically all of his wealth came from that later period of his life.
Pretty much.
That's incredible. It really shows how important time is.
Time is everything. Even with exceptional investing skills.
Yeah.
Without those decades of consistent compounding, the outcome would be totally different.
Yeah, it's not just about being a good investor. It's about giving your investments the time to grow.
Exactly. Housel actually contrasts Buffett with Jim Simons, who's a hedge fund manager.
Yeah.
Who had much higher average returns than Buffett.
Okay, so he was making more money on his investments.
Way more.
Goodness.
But because Simons started investing later in life, his overall wealth is significantly less than Buffett's.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing. It just goes to show you that time is the investor's greatest ally.
Patience is key.
Patience is key.
Huh.
But there's a catch. Getting rich is one thing, staying rich is another.
Oh, that's a good one.
To illustrate this, Housel introduces two really interesting historical figures.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Jesse Livermore
Okay.
and Abraham Jermansky.
I've never heard of either of them.
So Livermore was like this brilliant stock trader
Mm-hmm.
who made and lost fortunes multiple times throughout his life.
Oh, wow. So you have the ups and downs.
Huge ups and downs. And then Jermansky was a really successful real estate developer who was completely wiped out by the 1929 crash.
So both of them were good at making money,
They were amazing at making money.
but not so good at holding on to it.
So what was the missing ingredient?
That's the question.
Risk management and survival.
Yeah.
They took on too much risk,
Oh, I see.
and it ultimately led to their downfall.
So it's not enough to just get rich.
It's not enough.
You got to figure out how to stay rich.
And this principle applies to everyone, not just millionaires.
That's a good point.
It's about building a financial foundation that can withstand those ups and downs.
Yeah, life throws you curveballs.
Life throws you curveballs.
Ew.
The market throws you curveballs.
Hmm.
And sometimes the biggest threat to your wealth isn't some external factor. It's your own psychology.
That makes sense.
And this leads us to another fascinating story. Housel tells the story of Rajat Gupta, who was a former McKinsey CEO
Okay.
who ended up going to prison for insider trading,
Wow.
despite already having $100 million.
$100 million.
He had it all.
And he still risked it.
It really highlights this danger of never having enough.
It makes you think about what really drives people. Like, when is enough enough?
Exactly.
Like, at what point do you say, I'm good?
Right. And I think Gupta's story is like a cautionary tale.
Huh.
It shows us the dark side of ambition and greed.
The never-ending pursuit of more.
Yeah. It reminds us that financial success isn't just about accumulating wealth. It's about finding contentment and knowing when you have enough.
That's a really powerful message. And it ties in perfectly with this concept that Housel calls tails drive everything.
Okay, what's that?
So it emphasizes how a small number of extreme events often account for the majority of the outcomes, whether we're talking about business investing or even just life in general.
Okay, so it's like those outlier moments, those big wins or big losses.
Exactly.
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, so think about Walt Disney's career. He produced hundreds of hours of film, right?
Yeah, tons.
But it was those 83 minutes of Snow White that completely transformed the company. And similarly in the stock market, only 7% of the companies in the Russell 3000 index were responsible for most of its gains since 1980.
So a tiny percentage of companies drove the majority of the growth.
Exactly. While a whopping 40% of those companies actually lost most of their value.
Wow. So what does that mean for us? Like, how do we apply that to our own personal finances?
Well, it means that those few moments when you make critical decisions during times of like market panic or economic upheaval, those moments are going to determine your long-term success. Probably more than years of like normal investing.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure. It makes you realize how important it is to be prepared and to have a plan.
Exactly.
So it's not just about avoiding losses, it's about surviving those crucial moments.
Yeah.
So you can benefit from the long-term growth.
Right. You have to stay in the game long enough for that compounding to work its magic.
And that brings us to another critical concept: room for error.
I like this one.
It's about building a financial cushion that allows you to withstand those inevitable setbacks, which then allows you to stay in the game long enough for that compounding to do its thing.
Okay, so it's like having that emergency fund
Exactly.
for when life throws you a curveball.
Or when market throws you a curveball. Having that buffer to survive those market downturns. Unexpected expenses, any of life's surprises, it makes all the difference.
It's like that safety net that allows you to take calculated risks.
Totally. And this principle is often overlooked, but it's crucial for long-term financial well-being.
Yeah, it's about playing the long game.
And that connects really well with the next point. You'll change.
Oh, that's a big one.
Housel points out that people are notoriously bad at predicting their future selves. We always underestimate how much our values, and our desires are going to evolve over time.
Oh, that's so true. I think about some of the things I wanted 10 years ago, and they're totally different now.
Me too. So how can we plan for a future we can't even envision?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
The key, I think, is to avoid making extreme financial decisions. Those decisions that lock you into a single path.
Oh, that makes sense.
Build flexibility into your plans and acknowledge that your needs and priorities are going to shift. And be open to adjusting your course as you learn and grow.
That's such good advice. It's like embracing the unknown rather than trying to control every aspect of the future.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of control, Housel makes a fascinating point about the difference between being rational and being reasonable. When it comes to money,
Ooh, I like that.
he tells the story of Harry Markowitz, who was a Nobel Prize-winning economist.
Wow. Okay.
And believe it or not, he didn't even follow his own complex investment theories when it came to managing his own money.
Seriously?
Yeah. Instead, he opted for a simpler, more diversified approach.
So even the experts don't always follow their own advice.
Well, maybe it's not about ignoring the advice. Maybe it's about finding what works for you.
Yeah.
Because striving for perfect rationality in finance can be overwhelming. And it's unrealistic for most people.
It's too much pressure.
It is. So instead of aiming for perfect rationality, aim for pretty reasonable.
I like that.
It's more attainable. And it's definitely more sustainable.
Yeah, it's about finding that sweet spot
Yeah.
between complexity and practicality.
It is. It's about coming up with a strategy that you can actually stick with for the long haul.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think this is a good place to transition from the individual level to the broader economic landscape.
Okay, yeah.
Because Housen also talks about how historical events have shaped our financial realities.
I'm ready for a history lesson.
All right, let's go.
Let's dive into it.
So we're going to start our journey. In the aftermath of World War II,
Okay.
it was a period of immense economic uncertainty and transformation.
It was a whole new world.
It really was.
Everything was changing.
And you have to imagine the pressure that policymakers were under. They were terrified of a repeat of the Great Depression, with millions of soldiers returning home to a potentially stagnant economy.
Yeah, that's a lot to deal with.
It really was.
So they're thinking mass unemployment, social unrest.
It was a recipe for disaster.
So how do they try to prevent another economic catastrophe?
Well, one of their first moves was to keep interest rates low.
Okay.
Now, this might seem like a technical detail, but it had massive implications.
Okay, I'm listening.
Think about it. You're a soldier returning home from the war. You're ready to start a family. And suddenly, houses and cars become affordable for the first time.
Oh, wow. Because they could get cheaper loans.
Exactly.
So low interest rates encourage borrowing and spending.
And this stimulated economic activity.
Yeah.
And it really fueled a surge in consumer spending.
And it worked.
It did.
The economy started to recover.
It did. But it's important to note that this wasn't just some happy accident.
Yeah.
This shift from a wartime mentality of saving and conservation to a peacetime focus on consumption and growth, it was a deliberate strategy.
So they intentionally encouraged people to spend money.
Absolutely. They wanted to jumpstart the economy. And encouraging spending was a key part of that plan.
And this was further amplified by a really interesting phenomenon, a productivity boom that had actually been brewing for years. But it went largely unnoticed amidst the Depression and the war.
It was like this hidden force.
So what was driving this surge in productivity?
Well, it was a perfect storm of factors. Technological advancements, wartime innovations that were adapted for civilian use, and a workforce that was eager to rebuild and contribute to the nation's recovery.
So it was like all these ingredients coming together at the perfect time.
Exactly. And suddenly, America had an abundance of new inventions and the manufacturing capacity to produce them on a massive scale.
So you have this pent-up demand, meeting this newfound capability,
Right.
and what happened?
Americans went on a buying spree. Unlike anything the country had ever seen,
Wow.
car sales skyrocketed, home construction boomed, and the demand for appliances and other consumer goods just soared.
So it created jobs, it fueled economic growth, and it led to rising incomes for a lot of Americans.
Exactly.
It sounds like a golden age.
It does, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
but was it really?
Well, that's a great question, and that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, wait.
We'll uncover how the seeds of change were actually planted during this seemingly prosperous era.
Ooh, this is getting good.
It is.
Be sure to join us for part 2, where we'll explore how this post-war economic boom began to transform into something completely different.
It's going to be a wild ride.
I'm ready for it.
All right.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the psychology of money. So we left off talking about those cracks starting to show in the post-World War II economic picture. It's the early 1980s now. And a new era is dawning. Ronald Reagan's in the White House.
Ah, yes, the greed is good decade.
Right. Big hair, shoulder pads, and a massive shift in economic policy.
Very good word.
Reaganomics.
Yeah.
Ushered in an era of deregulation, tax cuts, and a renewed focus on those free market principles.
It was a big change from what came before.
It was.
And it wasn't just policy. This is also when computers started becoming more common.
Oh, yeah.
Businesses were going global.
Things were moving fast. And all of that led to another surge in economic growth.
It did.
But this time, things were different. The benefits weren't spread as evenly as they were in that post-war era.
Right. The pie got bigger, but certain slices grew much faster than others.
Right.
Incomes at the very top started to skyrocket.
While those in the middle and the lower tiers saw much smaller gains.
Or sometimes no gains at all.
Yeah, it was a real departure from the relative equality of the previous decades.
Housel calls this period the big stretch, because that's exactly what happened.
The gap between different income levels stretched wider and wider.
Wider and wider.
We started to see a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots.
And that had huge consequences.
Yeah, what happened as a result of this growing income disparity?
One of the biggest changes was a shift in what people expected their lifestyles to be like.
Yeah.
As the wealthy accumulated more and more wealth, their spending patterns changed dramatically.
Oh.
They bought bigger houses, fancier cars, sent their kids to elite schools, and indulged in these extravagant vacations.
Yeah, it was all about showing off that wealth.
It was, and the media amplified all of this.
Of course.
They showcased these lavish lifestyles.
To a wider and wider audience.
Yeah, everyone was seeing it.
So it's like the birth of the aspirational lifestyle.
Yeah.
Suddenly everyone wanted a piece of that luxury, even if their incomes couldn't support it.
Exactly. This culture that had previously valued shared sacrifice and modest aspirations started to embrace this keeping up with the Joneses mentality.
Yeah, it became all about appearances.
And it led people to feel pressure to maintain a certain standard of living, even if it meant going into debt.
Which brings us back to debt. We talked earlier about how those low interest rates after World War II encouraged borrowing. Did that trend continue through the 80s and beyond?
It did, but with a crucial difference. In the post-war era, debt levels were relatively low compared to incomes, and there was a cultural acceptance of borrowing for things like houses and cars.
Yeah, it was seen as responsible borrowing.
Right. But as income inequality grew, and those aspirational lifestyles became more common, debt started to climb at an alarming rate.
So it's not just that people were taking on more debt. It's that they were doing so from a much weaker financial position.
Exactly. That foundation was starting to crack.
And what happened?
Household debt-to-income ratios began to rise sharply, particularly among lower-income households.
So people were stretching themselves thinner and thinner.
To maintain a lifestyle they couldn't truly afford.
This sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was.
With anyone seeing the warning signs?
Housel mentions an economist named Hyman Minsky, who warned about the dangers of too much debt.
Okay.
He said that financial systems built on shaky foundations are very fragile. He described a cycle where periods of stability and prosperity can actually lead to complacency and excessive risk-taking.
So the good times can actually set us up for a fall.
Exactly.
And that brings us to 2008. And the housing bubble bursting.
Yeah.
Millions of people lost their homes, their jobs, their savings.
It was devastating.
Could this have been predicted?
Many economists believe it was the inevitable outcome of that big stretch we were talking about. And all that debt, years of easy credit, lending money to people who couldn't really afford it, and that belief that housing prices would just keep going up forever, well, it created a massive bubble.
And when bubbles get too big,
they burst.
But why do we fall into these traps over and over again?
Housel says it's because our emotions and our biases can cloud our judgment, especially when everyone's excited about the economy.
Yeah, we get caught up in the hype.
People get caught up in the excitement. They start believing that the good times will last forever, and they underestimate the risks.
They overestimate their ability to handle that debt.
They make decisions they later regret.
It's like we had this collective amnesia. We forget about past crises.
And we convince ourselves that this time is different.
Which it never is.
Right.
So what lessons can we learn from all of this? How can we apply the insights from the psychology of money to make smarter decisions and avoid repeating these mistakes?
That's the big question.
It is. And there's something Housel says that really struck me. He talks about how we often focus on things like GDP and jobs, but we forget about the power of narratives.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
The stories we tell ourselves about the economy, about whether things are good or bad, can really influence how we act.
And ultimately shape what actually happens.
Exactly. Like, he uses the example 2008 again. He says that the economic damage was much worse because of all the fear and panic that spread.
Yeah, everyone thought the world was ending.
Everyone believed the system was collapsing, and that belief made it collapse faster.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It is.
It's powerful stuff.
So what's the takeaway here?
I think it's a reminder that our perceptions and our beliefs can become reality, especially when it comes to money.
So we need to be careful about the stories we hear.
Think critically about the information we're consuming.
And avoid getting caught up in those waves of irrational excitement or doom and gloom.
It's about finding that balance.
Yeah. This reminds me of something else Housel talks about, the seduction of pessimism.
Oh!
He says that being negative often sounds smarter and more believable than being optimistic.
Even though history shows us that over time, progress usually wins out.
Yeah, why is that?
I think it's because pessimism plays on our fears.
It does.
It confirms our suspicions about the world.
And maybe it makes us feel a little bit superior.
It's like we're in the know.
Like we've figured it all out.
Exactly.
Housel uses the example of the Wright brothers. When they invented the airplane, people were so skeptical.
They didn't believe it was possible.
It took years for the world to accept that breakthrough.
Yeah, it's funny how that happens.
It is.
What seems impossible today can become commonplace tomorrow.
It's a good reminder that innovation is often met with resistance. But how does this relate to our own finances?
Well, I think it's about recognizing that being too pessimistic can make us miss opportunities.
Oh, I see.
It can lead us to make choices that are overly cautious or even harmful to our long-term financial well-being.
So acknowledge the risks,
Yeah,
but maintain a healthy dose of optimism
exactly.
and a belief in our ability to overcome challenges and reach our financial goals.
It's about finding that balance between being realistic and being hopeful.
Seeing the potential for both risk and reward.
And that's where House's personal insights become really valuable.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that.
He shares his own journey of figuring out what works for him.
And he stresses the importance of knowing your own risk tolerance.
Your time horizon.
And your financial goals.
Because what works for one person might not work for another.
It's all about finding what fits your individual situation.
Exactly.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the psychology of money.
Mm.
We've covered so much ground. From the history of money, to the psychology of risk, to the power of narratives. But I am so excited to finally get to this part. Morgan Housel's personal approach to managing money.
Yeah, me too. Because theories are one thing.
Right.
But actually seeing what an expert does is way more interesting.
Exactly. So spill the beans.
Okay, so one of the things that's really refreshing about Housel's approach is how much he emphasizes simplicity and long-term thinking.
Okay, I like the sound of that.
He's a huge advocate for something called low-cost index funds.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't finance experts, what exactly is an index fund?
So basically, it's like a basket of stocks that tracks a specific market index, like the S&P 500, for example.
Okay.
So instead of trying to pick individual stocks, you're essentially investing in a slice of the entire market.
Oh, so you're diversifying your investments.
Exactly.
And that helps reduce risk.
Right?
So no more trying to guess the next hot stock or time the market perfectly.
Not for Housel. He believes that for most people, the best approach is to invest consistently in a diversified portfolio of index funds and let the power of compounding do its thing over decades.
It's a really refreshing dose of practicality, especially in a world where everyone's obsessed with getting rich quick.
It is. It's about recognizing that slow and steady often wins the race, especially when it comes to building wealth. And it's not just about investing. Housel also stresses the importance of frugality.
Okay.
Not depriving yourself, but being smart about your spending.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that lately. It's not about having this boring life. It's more about aligning your spending with your values.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Spend money on the things that truly matter to you.
Yeah.
And cut back on the stuff that doesn't.
Exactly. Housel talks about the sense of freedom you get when you're not trapped by material possessions, or a lifestyle that forces you to always chase a bigger paycheck.
It's liberating.
It really is.
And he actually shares how he and his wife have kept a relatively modest lifestyle, even though they could afford much more.
Yeah, that's really inspiring.
And it's allowed them to save a significant portion of their income.
It's a good reminder that financial independence isn't about how much you earn, it's about how much you keep and how you use it to create a life that reflects your values.
Yeah, it's about having that control. And that brings us back to something we've been talking about this whole time. The need to understand your own psychology. When it comes to money,
it's so important.
What motivates you? What are your fears? What are your dreams?
Because at the end of the day, personal finance is personal.
There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. What works for one person might be a total disaster for someone else.
Totally.
So Housel really encourages readers to reflect on their own relationship with money.
Yeah, it's a really big deep.
What are your biases? What are your unique circumstances and goals?
And then use that self-awareness to build a strategy that actually works for you.
Right. He gives you guiding principles rather than a strict plan.
It's like a framework for thinking about your money.
Yeah, and he encourages you to take those ideas and make them your own.
That's what makes The Psychology of Money such a powerful book. It's not just about finance. It's about self-awareness. It's about your relationship with money. And it's about using money as a tool to build a life that's both meaningful and fulfilling.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive. But if you had to pick just one piece of advice, based on everything we've learned from The Psychology of Money, what would it be?
I would say take some time to really understand your own financial psychology.
Okay.
What drives your decisions? What are you afraid of? What do you truly aspire to?
Yeah, get to know yourself.
Exactly. And once you have a better grasp of your own motivations, you can start to build a financial strategy that helps you achieve your goals.
Whether that's retiring early, being financially independent, or simply living a life free from money stress.
It's all possible.
I love that. It really is all about taking control of your finances and using them to create the life you want.
Absolutely.
This has been such an amazing conversation. Thank you.
Of course, it's been a pleasure.
I've learned so much from The Psychology of Money.
Yeah.
And I know our listeners have too. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's one final thought-provoking question for everyone out there. Knowing what you know now about the psychology of money, what's one small change you can make in your own financial life to feel more confident and in control?
Maybe it's setting up automatic savings contributions. Maybe it's revisiting how you're investing.
Or maybe it's just having an open and honest conversation with your family about money.
Whatever it is, remember that small changes made consistently can have a huge impact on your financial well-being.
That's such a powerful reminder. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic, so stay tuned. Until then, happy reading, and remember, personal finance is a journey, not a destination.